Montana Territory, 1879. The wind carried the bite of early snow when Wesley Porter stepped off the stagecoach with her son pressed close against her side, and nothing else in the world but a stitched leather bag and a scar that ran from the corner of her jaw to her collarbone. Briar, 5 years old and too quiet for a boy that age, clung to her skirt with one hand and held a wooden horse in the other. He had not spoken since they crossed into Montana. His wide brown eyes tracked every movement around them like something might come leaping out of the pines. Wesley kept her back straight, chin high, even though her boots were worn thin and her ribs ached from hunger. She had learned long ago that people looked longer if you looked weak, and she had spent too many years being looked at the wrong way. The town of Elkhorn was smaller than she remembered from passing through years earlier, just a few dozen buildings, most with fading paint. She had no plan past setting foot here. She only knew she could not run any farther, and the man she had fled from would not think to look for her in a place where the mountains swallowed the sun before evening. They stood near the edge of the general store's boardwalk when the sound of hooves approached. A tall bay gelding slowed in front of them, and the man on its back reined in easy, the way a man does when he's used to not startling folks. He was older than she was, maybe 30 or so. Broad-shouldered, sunburnt, with a trimmed beard the same color as dry wheat. He wore a plain hat and a trail coat dusted with snow. His eyes were a clear gray, and they took her in without flinching, resting for half a breath too long on the bruising along her wrist. "You lost?" he asked, voice low, even, not unkind. "No," she said, even though she was. "Just off the stage." He looked down at Briar, who was staring up at the horse like it was a dragon. "Name's Porter Callahan," the man said, tipping his hat. "I run cattle about 2 miles west of here. Got a bunkhouse that's dry and a cook who makes a decent stew. If you're needing a place for the night." She met his gaze, waiting for the catch, for the look that usually came next, but there was nothing in his face but quiet patience. "I do not have money," she said. "Did not ask you for any." "What do you want, then?" Porter shifted in the saddle and looked toward the mountains. "Seems like you could use a place to breathe. That's all I am offering." Briar tugged her hand then, murmuring something too soft to hear. She looked down, and for the first time in days his eyes were not empty. They had hope in them. Wesley looked back up. "One night," Porter nodded once. "One night," he dismounted, offered her his hand. She hesitated, then took it. The Callahan ranch was simple but solid. A log house with a stone hearth and a wide porch. The barn smelled of hay and saddle soap. There were no other hands around. Porter said he worked alone mostly, hired help only during drives. Inside, the fire was already lit. Porter pulled off his coat and hung it near the door, then handed Briar a cup of warm milk. The boy curled up by the hearth without a word. "There is stew if you want it," Porter said. "It is not fancy." She did not answer, just stood in the kitchen, watching the way he moved, quiet, deliberate. Nothing about him was rushed. Nothing about him reached toward her. Later, after Briar had fallen asleep curled beside the dog Porter called Tumble, Wesley sat at the table and wrapped her hands around a chipped mug of tea. "You are not wondering what I ran from?" she asked, not looking up. "No," he said. "You are not curious? I saw enough when I looked at you." She looked up at him then. "Do you always offer shelter to strangers?" "No," he said, "but I figured a woman traveling with a boy that quiet had not had much kindness lately." She looked away fast. Her throat closed. She slept in the small back bedroom with Briar tucked close beside her. The bed was warm, the sheets clean. She did not sleep much, but she did not wake up screaming either. In the morning, he made eggs and coffee and left her alone. By the third day, Briar had spoken to Porter of all people. He asked if the man's horse had a name, and Porter had crouched beside him and said, "His name is Jasper, and he likes sugar if your mama lets you." Wesley watched from the porch, arms folded tight. She had not seen Briar smile since they left Kansas. That night she told Porter, "We will leave in the morning. I will not take more than what you have already given." He looked at her over the rim of his mug. "You could stay for a bit." "Why?" she asked. He shrugged. "The bunkhouse is empty, the barn needs sweeping. And your boy seems to like it here. I do not want pity. I am not offering it." She stared at him hard, trying to find the angle, the motive, but all she saw was a man who meant what he said. The days stretched. 1 became 3, then 5. Wesley started sweeping the barn without being asked. She made biscuits one morning and helped mend a fence with him the next. Porter never touched her, never asked questions. But he started leaving coffee for her on the porch at dawn. He taught Briar how to brush Jasper. And every time he came near, something in Wesley's chest softened just a little. One night after Briar fell asleep, she stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself. "I was married," she said, voice low. Porter stood beside her, not looking at her. "He was not kind, I figured. I stayed too long. You got out," she nodded. "He will look for us." Porter's jaw worked. "If he comes here, he will not get far." She turned to look at him. "Why are you doing this?" He looked her in the eye. "Because you needed a door open." "And I had one," she swallowed hard. "You do not even know me." "No," he said. "But I would like to." The first time he touched her, it was her hand. She was shaking after finding a dead fox near the chicken coop. It reminded her of a night she would never say out loud. He did not ask. Just rested his hand over hers until the shaking stopped. The second time she touched him. Her fingertips brushed his jaw while they stood in the barn, listening to the rain. He turned then, slowly, and looked at her like she was the most dangerous thing he had ever seen. Then he smiled. "Tell me to stop," he said. She did not. 2 weeks after she arrived, Wesley woke up in Porter Callahan's arms, her cheek resting on his chest, his hand curled around hers. Briar came into the room and climbed up beside them, the wooden horse tucked beneath his arm. Porter looked at him and said, "You warm, kid?" Briar nodded once, then curled closer. Wesley watched the snow fall through the window and knew, for the first time in years, she was not running anymore. By late November, frost sat thick along the fence rails each morning, and the creek that curved behind Porter's pasture ran slower, glassy with thin ice. Wesley rose early now, waking before the stove heat reached the corners of the house. She'd taken to splitting kindling after coffee, her sleeves rolled and her breath clouding in the cold. Porter never told her what to do. He'd just meet her eyes across the yard or the table, and something quiet would pass between them, acknowledgement, maybe, or understanding. He worked the land steady, kept the tack in order, repaired things before they broke. She liked that about him. Nothing hurried, nothing wasted. One morning, Porter came in with his hat tucked under one arm and a worn envelope in his hand. He set it on the table without comment, but Wesley noticed how long his fingers lingered on it before he let go. "You expecting something?" she asked, brushing off flour from her apron. "No," he said, "but it's from my sister. She writes when she gets restless. You close." He pulled out a chair, sat back. "Used to be. She married a railroad man in Denver. I haven't seen her since spring." Wesley watched the way his gaze drifted toward the window. "You miss her, sometimes," he said. "Mostly when I think about things I never said." She leaned on the edge of the table, one hand on her hip. "You the kind of man who keeps things to himself." He looked up at her then, not always by choice. They let the silence stretch. Outside, Briar's voice rose in laughter, light, brief. He was chasing the pup near the barn, his coat buttoned crooked, cheeks flushed. She watched him through the window, jaw tightening. "He's different here," she said. Porter stood, crossed to the stove. "He's safe here." Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. "That's not something he's known before." Porter stirred the beans warming in the pot. "Neither have you, looks like." She turned from the window, her voice low. "I don't know what to do with it. You don't have to figure it all at once." He looked over his shoulder, and for a long moment she didn't move. That afternoon, Wesley found the sewing kit tucked in the drawer by the hearth and mended the tear in Porter's work shirt. She didn't say anything when she handed it to him, just placed it folded on the bench near the door. He didn't say anything either, but the next morning he brought her the wool shawl from the cedar chest in the loft. She wore it out to the chicken coop, the color deep blue against the snow. When she came back in, he was setting a bowl of porridge on the table for Briar. "Did I ever tell you I was born in Missouri?" she said suddenly, shrugging off her coat. "No," Porter replied, his tone careful. "My daddy was a cooper. Used to let me hold the staves while he fitted the hoops. I liked the sound of the wood creaking when it bent. You ever think about going back?" She shook her head. "Not a single thing left there but dirt and ghosts." Porter nodded once. That evening, Briar fell asleep with his head in Wesley's lap while she sat near the fire. Porter sat across from her, one leg stretched long, whittling a piece of pine into something shapeless but smooth. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. He didn't look up. "I think about what holds." "And what's that?" He set down the carving. "Things that grow slow. Things that don't break easy." Wesley studied his face in the firelight. "I've only known things that crack wide open." He reached for the pot, poured her another cup of tea, and handed it to her without touching her fingers. "You're not cracked, Wes." She looked down at her lap, at Briar's sleeping face. "You don't know everything." "I know enough to see you're still standing." She didn't answer. Just sipped the tea and let the fire warm her knees. The next morning, Porter was already out in the north pasture before the sun rose. Wesley saddled the mule herself, Briar bundled on her hip, and rode out to meet him with a parcel of fresh cornbread wrapped in linen. She found him kneeling by the fence line, replacing a broken post. "You patch things before they splinter too far," she said, dismounting. "Only way to keep ground worth walking," he said, glancing up. She handed him the parcel. "You think that works with people?" "Sometimes," he said, tearing a piece of bread. "If they're willing." She watched him for a moment, then bent beside him, taking the next rail in her hands. Together they worked in silence, snow beginning to fall in fine, drifting flakes. It gathered in her hair, caught on the curve of his shoulder. She didn't brush it away. When they finished, he stood back. "You ever want to leave," he said, "I'll help you pack, and if you want to stay, I'll build you a place of your own." She met his eyes. "You do that?" "Yes." She looked down at her boots, then at the sky. "I don't want to be beholden." "You wouldn't be." Briar called from where he sat on a blanket near the fence, and she turned. When she looked back at Porter, something in her had steadied. "I'd rather build something with my own hands," she said. He nodded once. "Then we'll start with that." The first thaw came early that year, loosening the ground by mid-March and pulling the scent of wet pine into the wind. The snow around the barn slumped into slush, and the creek, dormant for months, began to run again, slow and full of silt. Wesley noticed the change in the earth before anything else. Her boots sank deeper into the softened path, and the air no longer bit so sharply at her skin. She had taken to feeding the hens before sunrise while Porter saw to the calving shed. Briar stayed close to her now, but not out of fear. He carried a small satchel Porter had made from an old saddlebag, filled with twine and pebbles he gathered from the creek. He still did not speak much, but he sang once under his breath while drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. Wesley heard it from the porch and stood frozen until it ended. That evening, as she hung a strip of jerky to dry by the hearth, she turned to Porter. "You ever think about leaving this land behind?" she asked. He was oiling a bridle, his hands steady, the leather dark with polish. "What for?" "Some folks head west, Oregon, California. I've heard talk in town." He wiped his hands on a cloth and looked over at her. "I've had enough of chasing what I don't know. This place has room to grow things. That's enough for me." She folded the cloth in her lap. "I used to think leaving would fix everything. I didn't realize it was the staying that mattered." Porter leaned back in the chair, the firelight catching his profile. "You plan to stay then?" "I don't plan much," she said. "But I'm learning how to look forward." The next morning, Porter rode into town for salt and seed. Wesley stayed behind, tending to the younger calf that had taken to following Briar around the yard. She noticed the tracks before Briar did deep wagon ruts where none should have been, leading up from the road and turning back again. She caught her breath and knelt beside them, fingers brushing the damp earth. They were fresh, midday, no more than an hour old. By the time Porter returned, dusk had crept into the valley. He found her waiting near the barn, rifle resting at the ready but not raised. "There was someone here," she said. He dismounted without speaking, his eyes following the direction she pointed. He crouched and studied the tracks with a frown. Wagon, 2 horses, no load, could be a trader passing through. Wesley shook her head. "No one comes this close unless they're looking for something." Porter stood slowly. "You think it was him?" "I don't know." "But I felt it." He nodded once, then led the horse into the barn. That night he placed the rifle against the outer doorframe and bolted the windows. He didn't say what she already knew. The next days passed watchful. Porter worked closer to the house. Wesley began sleeping with her boots on, just in case. She didn't tell Briar why she kept him inside, only that the wind was too sharp. He didn't protest. One morning, as the sun broke through a thin veil of cloud, Porter walked into the kitchen with a folded sheet of paper. "Sheriff's deputy posted this in town. Says someone's been circling ranches asking after a woman and a child." Wesley's hands stilled on the dough she'd been kneading. "He gave a name?" she asked. Porter shook his head. "Only said the man was dressed too fine for the road." "Had a pistol without wear." She stared down at the counter, her knuckles white with flour. "If he comes here—" "He won't," Porter said. She looked up at him, eyes clear. "You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise what happens if he does." She didn't speak, but her shoulders eased. That night, they sat by the fire after Briar had gone to sleep. The warmth flickered across the walls, and the tick of the cooling stove was the only sound between them. "I used to believe I'd never feel safe again," Wesley said softly. "That I was just surviving between storms." Porter glanced over, his voice low. "What changed?" "Being believed, without question." He shifted in his chair, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You don't owe me anything for that." "I know," she said. "That's what makes it matter." She reached across the space between them, her hand resting lightly on his knee. He covered it with his own, rough and warm. The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters once before quieting again. Inside, the fire burned steady. By early April, the valley had turned soft with green. Aspen buds split open along the hillsides, and calves nosed at the edges of the pasture, legs still unsure beneath them. The air held the clean scent of thawed earth, and the rhythm of the ranch turned toward planting, mending, and all the quiet work that came after winter's hold. Wesley spent more time outside now. She wore a pair of leather gloves Porter had sized for her hands, and by late morning, her sleeves were streaked with soil. She'd taken to tending the narrow patch of ground near the southern fence where the soil was richest. She didn't call it a garden, not yet, but she sowed carrot seed with careful fingers and spaced beans along string lines. Porter showed her how to run. One afternoon, while she knelt along the row, Porter came from the barn with a coil of rope over his shoulder and paused at the edge of her work. "That corner by the fence," he said, nodding toward a rise of flat stones. "It holds water better. You'll get stronger roots there." She shaded her eyes and looked up. "How do you know that?" "I watched it flood once," he said. "Wasn't much else to do but notice." She stood, brushing her hands clean. "You always pay attention when no one's looking?" "I try to." She studied him a moment, then turned toward the corner he'd mentioned. "Then I'll plant there tomorrow." That evening, after Briar fell asleep with his head against the dog's side, Wesley stepped out to the porch. Porter was already there, sitting with his boots on the rail and his hat tipped back. The light was low, fading behind the ridge, and the mountains stood dark against the pale sky. "It's quiet tonight," she said. He nodded without turning. "Most nights are." She leaned against the post. "I used to think quiet meant something was coming." Porter set his hat on his knee. "Sometimes it does. Other times it just means peace." She crossed her arms. "How do you tell the difference?" "You don't. You just learn how to breathe through both." She watched the last of the sun slip behind the pines. "I haven't built anything of my own since I was 16. You're building now." She didn't speak for a long while, letting the hush settle. "I never told you why I stayed as long as I did," she said quietly. He didn't move. "I was 14 when I met him. He was older, charismatic, I thought." I thought he saw me. She let out a thin breath. By the time I realized what I was inside of, no one believed me when I tried to leave. Porter's voice was low. You don't need to explain it to me. I'm not explaining, she said. I'm remembering out loud. There's a difference. He looked at her then, and something shifted between them, quiet but certain. I never learned how to be safe with a man, she said. You don't have to learn it with me, he said. You just get to be it. She stepped down from the porch and walked out into the yard, her boots soft on the spring grass. He followed without a word. She turned to look at him, the moonlight catching the edges of her face. If I stay, she said, I want it to be more than surviving. He took one step closer. Then let's build something worth holding. She reached out and touched the front of his shirt just above the buttons. Her hand stayed there, fingers splayed steady. I still flinch sometimes, she said. I know. I still wake with my fists clenched. I'll be here when you open them. She looked up and the space between them vanished. He kissed her like he understood every place she'd been broken, like she wasn't something to be fixed but someone to be met, honestly and without fear. When they pulled apart, neither of them said a word. The wind moved through the grass and the porch lantern flickered once, then held steady. In the days that followed, the garden started to sprout. Briar helped her pull weeds and placed small rocks around the tender shoots to keep the soil from running. Porter built a frame for a bean trellis, his hands moving slow and sure, and when he lifted it into place, Wesley stood beside him, hammer in hand, and drove the final nail herself. No more talk of wagons on the road. No more shadows in the corners. Just work and growth and the kind of quiet that healed instead of warned. One night, as Wesley folded laundry near the stove and Briar slept with a blanket tucked around his shoulders, Porter came in from the barn, his shirt damp with sweat and his hair streaked with sawdust. She looked up, her hands full of linen. You build something new, he leaned against the doorframe and nodded. Started framing a room off the north wall, should be big enough for a bed, a writing desk, and a window that catches the morning, she straightened. For who? For you, if you want it. She set the folded sheet aside. And if I want something else, he didn't move. Then I'll build that instead. She crossed the room slowly until she stood in front of him. I don't want a room of my own, she said. I want a home where I'm not waiting to leave. He reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Then stay. She leaned into him, her voice soft. I already have. Outside, the first crickets of spring began to sing. Inside, the fire burned low and the house held the warmth of something lasting. The first thunder rolled over the hills in early May, low and steady like a wagon wheel turning in the distance. Rain followed in sheets, soaking the fields and riverbank, turning the trails to mud so thick you could lose a boot if you weren't careful. Wesley stood under the porch eave, watching water stream off the edge of the roof, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Porter came up from the paddock, his coat slick with rain, and handed her the saddle blanket he'd taken from Jasper's stall. You'll catch chill standing out here. I like the sound of it, she said, voice low over the storm. Reminds me the ground's still alive. He stepped beside her, shook the rain from his hat. You always find meaning in things, she turned to glance at him. Only lately. He didn't press. Instead, they stood in silence, side by side, while the storm ran its course. By the time the rains passed, the fields had greened almost overnight. The garden behind the bunkhouse pushed up shoots so fast Wesley had to restake the beans twice in a week. Porter spent his days repairing the fence line past the slope, where runoff had carried part of it away. In the evenings, he returned with damp boots and fresh cuts on his hands, and Wesley cleaned them without asking where or how. One night after supper, she found him kneeling beside the hearth, carving something from a block of maple. His shoulders were tight, his brow drawn. The fire caught on the blade as he turned it, shaving curls onto the floor. You look like you're trying to keep your hands busy, she said, kneeling across from him. He hesitated, then passed her the carving. It was rough still, but the shape of a horse came through, small and sturdy with a notch along the neck where reins might go. For Briar, she asked. He nodded. Thought he could use something real. She ran her thumb along the wood. He's been asking how long we're staying. Porter looked up slowly. What did you tell him? I said we're not going. He didn't speak right away. Then you mean that? There's nothing I want to run from anymore. Porter's shoulders eased just a little. Then maybe I ought to stop building that separate room. She met his eyes. It's your house. No, he said. It's our home if you want it. I do, she said, and the words felt rooted, not just spoken. That night she woke to find Briar tangled in the blankets beside her, his breath deep and even. She rose quietly, stepped into the main room, and found Porter sitting at the table, candle low, papers spread before him. You always write this late? She asked. He half smiled, held up the page. Ledger figures, trying to plan ahead. For what? Winter, supplies, repairs. If we're 3 now, I've got to think wider. She crossed to him, leaned over his shoulder. Do you ever rest? He set his pencil down. Not when there's more to hold on to. She touched his hair, fingertips brushing the crown of his head. You don't have to carry it all yourself. I know, he said, but I've never had someone to carry it with. You do now. The next morning they went into town. The ride was slow, the trail still soft from rain. Wesley kept Briar close in front of her on the mule, his arms wrapped around her waist as he dozed against her back. At the mercantile, Porter stepped away to speak with the clerk, leaving Wesley to inspect seed packets near the window. A voice behind her, too smooth to be local, said, You dropped something, ma'am. She turned slowly, heart catching in her throat, but it was only a traveler, a man with pale eyes and city shoes holding out a folded scrap of paper. She looked down. It wasn't hers. Not mine, she said, stepping aside. He tipped his hat, moved on. Porter returned a moment later, saw the look on her face. Everything all right, she nodded. Just wasn't expecting strangers today. He took her hand. You're not alone. They returned to the ranch by dusk, the sky wide and pink behind them. Porter built a fire while Wesley stirred stew, the smell of onion and thyme warming the room. Briar sat at the table, tracing lines through a worn copy of a primer Porter had brought from a schoolhouse auction. Later, after the dishes were set to dry and Briar was tucked in with the wooden horse resting beside him, Porter joined Wesley outside. The stars were out in full, the moon high and clean. I had a letter from my sister, he said. She looked over. What did she say? She's with child, due before winter, asked if I'd come visit. Will you? I told her I couldn't leave the ranch just now. Got too many roots growing here. Wesley stepped closer. You could send word. Tell her she has more family than she thought, he nodded. I already did. They stood there a while longer, the night warm enough to linger. I never thought peace would feel like this, she said, her voice quiet. Not loud, not sudden, just steady. Porter wrapped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. That's the kind worth building. She leaned into him, her cheek against his chest. I love you. He rested his chin atop her head. I know. I've known since the first time you didn't flinch. They stayed there until the last candle flickered out inside, and only the stars kept watch. 2 months later, on the longest day of summer, Porter stood beside Wesley beneath a cottonwood tree behind the barn, the branches strung with ribbon and wildflowers Briar had gathered. The preacher from Elkhorn spoke soft and brief, his voice half lost in the wind. They exchanged rings Porter had carved himself, simple bands of polished pine. Briar stood beside them, holding both their hands, his eyes bright in the sun. Afterward, Wesley laid her palm against Porter's cheek and said, You gave me back everything I thought I'd lost. He kissed her knuckles, one by one. You just needed someone to stand still long enough to find it. The garden flourished. The calves grew strong. Letters came from Denver, full of news and hope. And each evening, as the sun dipped low and the mountains turned gold, Wesley stood in the doorway of the house she helped build, her son at her side, her husband behind her, and knew without fear or doubt that she was home.